Hello everyone, my name is Mark Halsey. I'm here with Fiona Halsey. Together, 20 years ago, we started Halsey Legal, and some years after that, we started Licensee Solutions, a financial services compliance firm. We're here today to talk about a federal court case that was handed down just 2 days ago, and that's the case of ASIC versus RI Advice relating to cybersecurity issues. So I'll ask Fiona to kick off by giving us the background to the case.
Yes, it's a very interesting case in that ASIC is concerned about concerned about the cybersecurity of RI's actual representatives.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a different situation to them being concerned about, for example, RI's internal own arrangements. It was in the representatives. And the case was actually settled in many ways between ASIC and RI almost on the steps of the court.
Mm-hmm.
And the consequences of that were that there's an agreed statement of facts and there was agreed orders in some aspects. But at the same time, some of it was left so that the court actually made findings in respect of whether RI had breached its licence conditions. So very interesting in that way, because it's quite frequently the case that when, for example, in private litigation between two people suing each other, normally in a court, you would often have a situation where there's a settlement, and what would happen is that the terms of that whole settlement would be entirely confidential.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, you don't have that. You have some aspects being settled and other aspects where we get to see what actually happened, and to have the court findings. So very interesting, very hybrid.
Sure. So in terms of the background, as you were saying, it's not directly related to RI, the actual licensee, but the representatives who operate their own offices and own effectively little businesses, and the cybersecurity relating to that, their respective businesses.
That's right.
And RI was held to be, found to be responsible.
There were issues. Exactly, there were issues. It's more a question of whether they satisfy their licence conditions or not.
Mm-hmm.
So between 2014 and 2020, there were, in broad terms, 9 different types of cyber security breaches. And if I summarise those, I'd say that there were situations where false emails were sent.
Mm-hmm.
So, the kind of emails where some criminal sends an email and says, please transfer this amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
And in one circumstance, a client actually transferred around $50,000.
Right.
There was another circumstance where the criminals set up a fake website, and were sitting on top of the representative's actual website. So then there was a case where there was ransomware, and they captured quite a number of clients' information, and then wouldn't release it, and still haven't released it. That information is still not gotten back. And then probably the most serious one was a situation where thousands of clients' private information was hacked, and that information has actually been used in quite a number of circumstances, has been used in unauthorised ways.
Mm-hmm.
So there were quite a number of different things that happened. I'd say they're probably the major 4 types that occurred, but over a number of years. And then in 2018, RI became aware of the problems and started putting in place stronger measures and it started trying to encourage the representatives to have better cybersecurity, and it made it part of the contracts with the reps, but it still wasn't quite good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So that continued on until eventually you end up in this situation with ASIC.
Right. So when you say it wasn't good enough, what were the ongoing failings?
The failings that occurred were, in general terms, and I'd say this is over the whole period.
Sure.
Okay. So what you've got shared passwords. So in one office, you'll have everyone using the same password. Okay. You have circumstances where apparently emails were being stored on the cloud where there was no virus protection. So that was significant.
So no virus protection on the representatives.
That's right.
Computer.
Exactly.
Okay.
So circumstances like that, and no backups happening,
Okay.
or happening very infrequently.
Okay.
So lots of, the real basics.
Right.
Mm.
Okay. So what were the financial consequences for RI?
The financial consequences for RI directly are probably not that great.
Mm-hmm.
So they agreed to make a contribution to ASIC's costs of $750,000.
Mm-hmm.
They obviously would have carried their own costs, and you'd expect, typically, when you look at costs of a regulated versus costs of a defendant, normally the costs of the defendant are greater. So they would have obviously had that. And then they have to have a cybersecurity firm come and consider what's been done now and whether that's adequate.
That's not going to be cheap.
No, I wouldn't have thought so. But the biggest financial issue is unlikely to be those things.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually likely to be the situation that you now have got a finding by the federal court.
Okay.
And I'll talk about what that finding is in just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But that finding in itself will make it easier for people to, if they have lost through this, to be able to bring an action.
Because you don't have to prove a breach anymore. It's a finding of fact, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly what you've got.
Mm.
Okay, so that's. So I'll talk now about what the court actually found. So the facts were agreed. So then it was a question between RI and ASIC. So then it was a question of thinking, well, what was that a breach of?
Mm-hmm.
And what the court found is it found that this was a breach of 912A1A of the Corporations Act, which is the requirement to carry on with your AFSL to be honestly, efficiently and fairly.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the very interesting things is that they saw that, they broke that phrase up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And what they said there is they said that it wasn't the case that these people hadn't been dishonest. So it wasn't a breach of honestly, efficiently and fairly, it was just a breach of efficiently and fairly.
Mm.
And then they also found that it was a breach of 912A1H, which is a requirement to have in place adequate risk management systems.
Right.
And they found they didn't have that.
Right.
So you had two quite clear circumstances there. And I think that will potentially have consequences if any clients have lost money pursuant to this and yet haven't been yet refunded. And they may, I'm not sure if they may actually have been paid out already.
Makes for a very simple AFCA complaint, doesn't it?
Well, that is a very interesting question because in the last year or so, there have been a number of cases where, particularly in respect of cryptocurrencies, where the question has been whether or not the provider, the AFSL or FSP, however they call it in those decisions, has actually had in place adequate systems. And in quite a lot of cases, it's been found that they actually had adequate systems and therefore they weren't liable and it was the criminal's fault and it was unfortunate for the client, but that's how it worked out. But with this, what you've then got is this finding.
The federal court saying they didn't.
Exactly.
And by the sound of it, the licensee actually agreeing to it. These were a statement of agreed facts.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, incredible. Yes. There's an interesting takeaway from my perspective if I were looking at it from a licensee's viewpoint. And that is, since I, as the licensee, am responsible for the cybersecurity of the representatives' operations, that now should, as a takeaway, should become built into and incorporated into the regular audits and reviews of representatives to make sure that the representatives have robust systems, because oftentimes the representatives, often many licensee models don't have a standard software obligation in respect of things like antivirus, etc., across the entire distribution channel.
That's right, and I was thinking about that when we were chatting about this before this, and I was thinking about the fact that the nature of representative reviews has changed quite significantly. So it used to be the case that frequently the licensees would actually send a person out to the representative's office, and what they would do is, because all the files were paper-based, they actually used to go out there. And while they were out there, they often had a bit of a look around as to what was going on in the office. They checked the signage, there's quite a lot of, and they got a general feeling for what was happening in the office. But those things have changed a bit because with the no paper files anymore, frequently the reviews are being done virtually, and that is quite an interesting change in that respect, because we've got a situation if the only review is actually an SOA review,
yes,
which has been done by some kind of algorithm, then those reviews I think will need to be expanded in the context of this case.
Or someone will have to perform this as part of a review process.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any other?
Well, I think that a couple of the things that I think are interesting from this are that the court has not looked at the criminals and said, these are the cyber criminals, and said bad cyber criminals, okay, it's their fault, okay. Instead, they've said that there needs to be a really quite a good level of security. So I think that's interesting in itself, in that they've said that. And the other thing is that they've looked at an AFSL, and quite often the AFSL's actual office would have good security, but the representative itself maybe not so much. I think that's okay. And the last thing I'd say is I think that this has consequences for other professions.
Yes, of course.
Because although other professions don't have an AFSL requirement in the same way, they still have requirements to keep information private and confidential. And that would then have a certain base in terms of expectations.
Yes.
And in a world where we're all moving faster and faster towards virtual everything and more cloud, it means that the requirements there are greater than ever. So, well, thanks for helping with this.
Pleasure.
And what we're going to do now is we'll put the citation up on a screen at the end of this. And may I also remind everyone that this is just, this is a short talk to tell you about the issues. Please don't act or refrain from acting based on this conversation. Please get some customised advice, and definitely do not rely just on this. But thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Bye.